The cold wasn't a feeling. It was a hunter. It stalked you across the endless white, got inside your bones, and slowed you down until you just stopped. Margaret Turner knew this. She felt it in the burn of her lungs with every shallow breath. She felt it in the dead weight of her daughter, Lily, who had long since stopped crying in her arms. The silence was the thing that scared her most. Lily was too quiet, too still. Margaret pulled the thin blanket tighter around the child, her own lips cracked and blue. "We're almost there, sweetheart," she whispered into the wind, but the words were a lie. She had no idea where there was. The world had vanished into a blizzard. Sky and ground were one. No road, no trees, no signs of life. Just the relentless, biting wind and the feeling that she was the last person left on Earth. She'd been walking for hours, maybe days. Time didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the next step, and the next. Because stopping meant giving the hunter what it wanted. Stopping meant death. She thought of her husband, Robert, of the warm cabin they'd built with their own hands. A home, a life, gone, vanished just as fast as the heat from her body. After Robert's accident, the world had turned colder than any winter. His own family had made sure of that. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The fire in their hearth burning low. The air thick with words that wouldn't be spoken. Her husband's brother, Thomas, stood across the room, his face a mask of stone. "You can't stay here," he'd said. The words weren't a suggestion. They were a verdict. "We have nowhere else to go," she'd pleaded, her voice trembling. Thomas hadn't even looked at her. He'd looked at his wife, who stared at the floor as if searching for a crack to fall into. "We can barely feed ourselves," Thomas had sneered. "A widow and a child? You're not our problem, Margaret. Not anymore." Not anymore. As if the piece of paper that said she was married to his brother had been the only thing holding them together. As if love and blood meant nothing. Lily had clutched her dress, tiny fingers digging into the fabric. "Please," Margaret had whispered, the last of her pride crumbling. "She's just a child." The bolt sliding shut on the cabin door had been the loudest sound she'd ever heard. It was the sound of the world ending. Margaret blinked, forcing the memory away. The howling wind was her only companion now. That and the cold. That door had closed, but she was still walking. She had to keep walking. And then she saw it. Through the swirling snow, a shape. Dark against the endless white. A building. A small cabin. Hope surged through her, so fierce it almost buckled her knees. Shelter, warmth, safety. She took a step forward, a cry of relief dying in her throat. Because a new sound cut through the storm, a low, guttural growl. Margaret froze. She turned her head slowly. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It stood just yards away. A wolf. Gaunt and starving, its yellow eyes locked onto her. It had been following them. She knew it instantly. It had been waiting for her to get weak, waiting for her to fall. And she was so weak. Lily stirred in her arms, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Margaret tightened her grip, pulling her daughter behind her. She had a small knife in her pocket, a useless trinket against teeth and claws. But she would fight. She would lose, but she would die fighting. The wolf coiled, its muscles bunching beneath its matted fur. It was going to lunge. This was the end. A gunshot cracked through the air. The sound was so loud, so sudden, it felt like the sky itself had split open. The wolf collapsed, its lunge cut short, its body thudding into the snow just feet from where she stood. For a second, there was nothing but the ragged sound of her own breathing. Then she saw him. A man. Standing a short distance away, a rifle held steady in his hands. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. He didn't move. He just watched her. Another threat? Another door about to slam in her face? He lowered the rifle. His voice was calm, steady, cutting through the wind. "You need help?" Margaret couldn't speak. She looked from the stranger to the dead wolf, then down at her daughter. Lily's lips were pale, her tiny fingers curled weakly in her shawl. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Please," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. "Help her." The man nodded once. He took a step closer, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Margaret let someone else carry the weight. But as he took Lily from her arms, his eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. And in them, she saw something that wasn't pity. It was something else, something that looked like recognition, and that was more terrifying than any wolf. The cabin was small, just one room, but it was warm. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, chasing the chill from Margaret's bones. The man, he said his name was James, had placed Lily on a simple cot, piling thick wool blankets over her small frame. He moved with a quiet purpose, never wasting emotion. Margaret stood by the door, unwilling to move further into the room. She felt trapped, exposed. He had saved them, yes, but no one did anything for free, not in this world. She was waiting for the price. James leaned his rifle against the wall. "She'll be warmer soon," he said, his back to her. "She needs food, broth, something easy." Margaret just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He ladled some broth from a pot near the fire into a wooden bowl and set it on the small table. "It ain't much," he said, his voice even, "but it'll help." Her stomach growled, betraying her. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She crossed the room and sat, her fingers wrapping around the warm bowl. The heat seeped into her skin, a feeling so foreign she almost flinched. The first spoonful was agony and relief all at once. It spread through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. James sat by the hearth, sharpening a knife. He didn't stare. His gaze would flick towards her, then away, giving her space. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't threatening either. It was watchful. She glanced at Lily. Her daughter's breathing was deeper, more even. The terrifying stillness was gone. She was sleeping, really sleeping. A wave of gratitude washed over Margaret, so strong it made her dizzy. But it was followed by a sharp spike of suspicion. Why? Why would a man living alone in the middle of nowhere help a stranger? "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. James gave a slight nod, not looking up from his knife. "You're welcome." She studied his profile in the firelight. His face was weathered, carved with lines that spoke of hardship. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, startling gray, and they seemed to see more than they let on. That flicker of recognition she'd seen outside. It hadn't been her imagination. "You live here alone?" she asked, testing the waters. "For a while now," he answered, his voice non-committal. "You don't ask a lot of questions." He finally looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. "Figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know, when you were ready." That was not the answer she expected. People always wanted to know your story. They wanted to pick it apart, judge it, find your weaknesses. This man's patience was unsettling. It felt like a trap of a different kind. She looked at Lily again, safe beneath the blankets. "We had nowhere else to go," she admitted, the confession tasting like ash in her mouth. James just nodded, as if this was the most common story in the world. Maybe it was. But as he turned back to his knife, the firelight caught on something hanging from a thin leather cord around his neck. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age. He tucked it back under his shirt quickly, but not before she saw it. It was identical to the one her husband Robert used to wear. Margaret's blood ran cold. It couldn't be. It was just a coincidence, a common design. But her hand instinctively went to her own neck, where a matching locket, A wedding gift from Robert used to be. The one Thomas had ripped from her throat the night he threw her out, claiming it as payment for some phantom debt. The broth in her stomach turned to lead. This man wasn't a stranger. He couldn't be. But who was he? And what did he want with her? The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt like the heat of a closing cage. She wasn't safe here. She had just traded one predator for another. The next morning, Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The feeling of warmth was so complete, so disorienting, that for a moment she forgot her fear. She sat up. Lily was still asleep beside her, a faint flush of pink back in her cheeks. Across the room, James stood at the stove, his back to her. The image was so domestic, so normal, it warred with the terror that had kept her awake half the night. "There's coffee," he said, without turning around. She rose, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and poured a cup. Her hands trembled slightly. She watched him, looking for any sign, any clue. He moved with an easy grace, plating up some cornbread and bacon. He set a plate on the table for her. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice strained. "Figured you'd be hungry," he replied, still not looking at her. It was as if he knew she was studying him, and he was deliberately giving nothing away. Then Lily stirred. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and looked around the unfamiliar room. Her gaze landed on James, and she froze, her small body tensing with fear. James, to his credit, didn't turn. He seemed to shrink in on himself, making himself smaller, less threatening. Lily looked at her mother, her eyes wide with a silent question. "Where are we?" she whispered. "A man helped us," Margaret said, her voice softer than she felt. "We're safe." The word felt like a lie. "Who is he?" Lily whispered back. Before Margaret could answer, James spoke, his voice quiet. "My name is James." He still didn't turn. He was speaking to the wall, but the words were for them. Lily didn't respond. She just scooted closer to Margaret. Trust didn't come easy for her. Margaret understood that better than anyone. James put a smaller plate of food on the table near the edge, then retreated to his chair by the fire. It was an offering, a gesture of peace. Lily watched him, then looked at the food. Her hunger won. She cautiously crawled to the edge of the cot, reached out, and pulled the plate onto her lap. She began to eat in small, careful bites, her eyes never leaving the man by the fire. James picked up a block of wood and his knife and began to whittle. The soft scrape of the blade was the only sound. He was ignoring them, giving them the illusion of privacy, but Margaret felt his awareness like a physical presence. He knew they were watching him. Later that day, as Margaret was mending a tear in Lily's dress, she watched her daughter. The initial fear had faded, replaced by a quiet curiosity. Lily sat on the cot, watching James as he carved. His hands were large and calloused, but they moved with a surprising delicacy. The block of wood was slowly taking the shape of a small bird. He glanced up, his gray eyes catching Lily's. "You ever seen a sparrow up close?" he asked. Lily blinked, surprised, and shook her head. "Most birds fly south for the winter," James said, his voice low and raspy. "But not sparrows. They're tough. They stay." He held up the nearly finished carving. It was beautiful, the details of the feathers etched with incredible precision. He turned it over in his hands, then, without another word, he placed it on the table and went back to his work. It was an invitation. Margaret held her breath. After a long moment, Lily slid off the cot. She crept toward the table, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She glanced at James, but he didn't look up. She reached out a tentative hand and picked up the wooden bird. She held it to her chest, her small fingers tracing the lines of its wings. A fragile truce had been formed, but Margaret's own unease only grew. This kindness felt practiced, strategic. He was winning over her daughter, and she didn't know why. Every gesture of goodwill felt like another bar locking into place. That night, she couldn't sleep. She waited until Lily's breathing was deep and even, then slid out of bed. The cabin was lit only by the dying embers in the hearth. She needed answers. She moved silently across the room, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. His coat was hanging on a peg by the door. Her heart pounded as she reached into the pockets. Nothing. Just a spare box of shells and a worn leather pouch of tobacco. Her eyes fell on a small, locked wooden chest under his cot. Her breath hitched. She knelt down, her fingers tracing the cold iron of the lock. It was small, easily broken, but the sound would wake him. She looked over at his chair. He was asleep or pretending to be, his head tilted back, his breathing slow and regular. This was her chance. She found a small poker by the fire, its tip thin enough to fit into the keyhole. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. She slid the tip in, wiggling it, feeling for the tumblers. There was a faint click, then another. The lock sprang open. She paused, listening. James didn't stir. Slowly, carefully, she lifted the lid. Inside, on top of a pile of yellowed papers, was a photograph. It was old and faded, the corners bent. It showed two young men, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One of them was a younger James. The other one was her husband, Robert. Margaret's vision swam. A wave of nausea washed over her. It wasn't a coincidence. They knew each other. They were friends. Why hadn't he said anything? What was he hiding? Her trembling fingers dug deeper into the chest. Beneath the photograph was a bundle of letters tied with a string. She recognized Robert's handwriting immediately. She untied the string and unfolded the top letter. "James," it began. "Thomas has done it. He sold the northern pasture without telling me. He says the money is gone, a bad investment, but I know he's lying. He's been skimming from the profits for months." I confronted him, but he just laughed. He said I have no proof. He's trying to push me out, to take everything we built. I fear what he'll do next. He's not the brother I grew up with. There's a darkness in him. Be careful, my friend. Don't trust him. The letter was dated just a week before Robert's accident. A fall from a horse, they'd said. A tragic misfortune. But it wasn't an accident. It was murder. Thomas had killed her husband. He had killed his own brother to steal their land, their future. And James knew. He must have known. That's why he was here, hiding in the wilderness. He wasn't just a hermit. He was a man in hiding, a man waiting. But waiting for what? A floorboard creaked behind her. "You shouldn't have done that, Margaret." She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. James was standing there, no longer asleep. His face was cloaked in shadow, but she could see the cold, hard glint in his eyes. The friendly stranger was gone. In his place was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. "Who are you?" she whispered, the letters clutched in her hand. He took a step forward, and she scrambled back, knocking over the small chest. The papers scattered across the floor. "I'm the man your husband trusted," he said, his voice a low growl. "And I'm the man who is going to make Thomas pay for what he did." He looked down at her, and then at Lily, still sleeping peacefully on the cot, oblivious. "The question is," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "are you with me, or are you in my way?" The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken history. Margaret stared at James, the scattered letters a testament to the lies that had defined her life. Robert hadn't just died. He'd been erased. By his own brother. "He told me Robert had debts," she said, her voice shaking with a rage she hadn't known she possessed. "He said you were one of them, a failed business partner who ran off and left Robert to clean up the mess. He used that lie to take everything." James's jaw tightened. "There were no debts. There was a partnership. We built a ranch together, Robert and I. Thomas was supposed to handle the books in town. Turns out he was handling them for his own benefit. Robert found out. And a week later, his horse stumbled on a clear path. His words hung in the air, cold and sharp as icicles. I tried to go to the sheriff, James continued, his voice low and bitter, but Thomas had already paid him off. He had papers drawn up, forged with Robert's signature, claiming I'd sold my half of the partnership to him for a pittance. He told everyone I was a swindler who'd fled. By the time I realized what had happened, I was a wanted man. It all clicked into place. The locket, the recognition in his eyes. He hadn't just recognized her. He'd been looking for her, for the wife of his murdered friend. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she asked, the anger giving way to a raw, aching grief. "And say what?" "Hello. Your brother-in-law is a murderer, and I'm a fugitive hiding in the woods. Trust me?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure exhaustion. "I tracked you after Thomas threw you out. I saw your footprints heading into the storm. I was afraid I was too late." The wolf. He hadn't stumbled upon them by chance. He had been following them, protecting them, the weight of it all pressed down on her, the lies, the betrayal, the cold-blooded murder of the man she loved. And this man, this ghost from her husband's past, had been watching over them from the shadows. "What do you want, James?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I want justice," he said, the words simple but heavy with years of grief and anger. "Thomas thinks you and the girl are dead. He thinks he's won. He's gotten away with everything, but he doesn't know you're here. He doesn't know I'm here. He's gotten comfortable. Reckless." A plan was forming in his eyes, something cold and calculated. "He's planning to sell the last of the land," James said. "Our land. The deed requires a signature from Robert's next of kin. He'll forge it, of course, but he has to go to the land office in person to file the papers, and I know when he's going." He looked at her, and she understood. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming what was stolen. For Robert. For Lily. "He won't expect to see you," James said. "A ghost walking into the land office. It will shake him. It will make him make a mistake." Margaret thought of Lily, sleeping so peacefully. She thought of the life that had been stolen from her, a life of warmth and safety, not one of running and hiding. Thomas had tried to bury them in the snow, to let the wilderness erase his crime. But they had survived. She had survived. She stood up, her legs steady now. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. She would not let him win. She would not let Robert's memory be a lie. "Tell me what we need to do," she said. The days that followed were filled with a tense energy. The quiet rhythm of the cabin was gone, replaced by the hushed tones of planning. James laid out the details. The town was a 2-day ride away. Thomas was scheduled to be at the land office on Friday at noon. They would have to be there before him. "He'll have men with him," James warned. "He's gotten paranoid in his old age." "He has reason to be," Margaret replied, her voice cold. James taught her how to use a pistol, not the heavy rifle he carried, but a smaller, more manageable revolver he kept hidden away. Her hands shook the first time she held it, the weight of it a terrifying reality. But as James guided her, his hands steady over hers, she learned. She learned to load it, to aim, to control her breathing. The sound of the gunshot echoing through the trees was the sound of her fear turning into something else, something harder. Lily watched them, her small face serious. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the shift in the air. She grew quieter, her wooden sparrow clutched tight in her hand. One afternoon, she walked up to James as he was cleaning his rifle. "Are you going to go away?" she asked, her voice small. James stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He knelt down so he was at her level. "We have to go take care of something," he said gently. Something bad that a man did a long time ago. But we're coming back. Promise? She whispered. James hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he looked at Margaret. I promise, he said, his eyes on her. It felt like a vow. The night before they left, a sense of dread settled over the cabin. What if this didn't work? What if Thomas was too powerful, too well connected? What if they were walking into a trap? Margaret found James standing outside, staring up at the moonless sky. Are you afraid? She asked. I've been afraid every day for 5 years, he admitted, not looking at her. Afraid I'd never get the chance to make it right. Afraid I'd let Robert down. He finally turned to her, his face grim in the pale starlight. Now I'm just afraid for you. And for her. Thomas took my husband, Margaret said, her voice steely. He took my home. He tried to take my daughter's life. I'm not afraid of him anymore. I'm just angry. He saw the truth of it in her eyes. The woman he'd found half frozen in the snow was gone. The fire he saw in her now was hotter than any hearth. He reached out, and his fingers brushed her cheek. It was a fleeting touch, barely there, but it sent a jolt through her. It wasn't a gesture of pity or even comfort. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. Robert was a lucky man, he said softly. The words hung between them, filled with the ghosts of what might have been. But there was no time for ghosts. Tomorrow they were going to hunt a monster. The ride to town was a blur of silent tension. They left before dawn, with Lily bundled in blankets and placed in front of James on his horse. Margaret rode a smaller mare James had kept hidden in a lean-to. The world felt sharp and dangerous. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird made her jump. They arrived on the outskirts of the town as the sun was setting. It was a dusty one-street settlement with a handful of wooden buildings. The land office, the saloon, the sheriff's office. It all looked so small, so ordinary, for a place that held so much evil. James led them to a small, abandoned line shack a few miles out. We'll wait here until morning, he said. No one slept that night. Margaret sat by the small window, watching the lights of the town flicker and die, the pistol resting heavy in her lap. James sat across from her, cleaning his rifle for the 10th time, his movements methodical, calming. Lily slept between them, a small, warm bundle of innocence in a world that had none. Morning came, gray and cold. It's time, James said. He had a plan. Margaret and Lily would go to the general store across from the land office. Stay out of sight until you see Thomas go inside, he instructed. Then you walk in. Act surprised to see him, confused. Let him think you're just a poor widow looking for a handout. And you? She asked. I'll be close by, was all he said. Walking into town felt like walking onto a stage. People stared at her ragged clothes, her worn face. She kept her head down, her arm wrapped protectively around Lily. She bought a small piece of candy for her daughter at the general store, her hands fumbling with the coins James had given her. Then she positioned them by the front window, behind a barrel of pickles, and waited. Her heart pounded with every tick of the clock on the wall. 10 o'clock. 11. Then, at 11:45, a wagon pulled up outside. It was Thomas. He looked older, heavier. His face was puffy, his eyes small and mean. He was flanked by 2 hired men, thugs with guns on their hips. A wave of pure hatred washed over Margaret. This man had destroyed her life and slept soundly at night. He swaggered into the land office, his men taking up positions by the door. This was it. Stay here, sweetheart, Margaret whispered to Lily, pressing the wooden sparrow into her hand. Don't move until I come back for you. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked out of the store. The world seemed to slow down, the dust motes dancing in the air, the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. She crossed the street, her gaze fixed on the door of the land office. One of the thugs moved to block her way. "Office is closed for private business," he grunted. "I have business with Mr. Turner," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "He's my brother-in-law." The man's eyes widened in confusion. Before he could stop her, she pushed past him and opened the door. The room was small, smelling of old paper and dust. Thomas was standing at the counter, a sheaf of papers spread out before him, the clerk looking on nervously. He glanced up as she entered, his face a mask of irritation. Then his eyes focused on her. The color drained from his face. He looked like he had seen a ghost, which, in a way, he had. "Margaret?" he stammered, his hand going to his chest. "But you... the storm..." "The storm was cold," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even her. "But you're colder, Thomas." He stared at her, his mind scrambling. "What are you doing here? What do you want?" "I want what's mine," she said, taking a step forward. "I want what you stole from my husband, from my daughter." Thomas let out a short, ugly laugh, regaining some of his composure. "You have nothing. You hear me? Robert left you with nothing but his debts." "He left me with his name," she shot back. "And his half of this land, the land you're trying to steal with forged papers." The clerk's eyes widened. Thomas's face turned a blotchy red. "That's a lie. Get her out of here," he snarled at his men, who were now crowding into the doorway. "Is it a lie, Thomas?" a new voice said. James stepped through the doorway, his rifle held loosely at his side. He wasn't aiming it, but he didn't need to. His presence filled the room, cold and dangerous. Thomas spun around. If he looked like he'd seen a ghost before, now he looked like he'd seen the devil himself. "James, you're supposed to be... gone?" James finished for him, a grim smile on his face. "You tried, but I'm harder to get rid of than my partner was." The accusation hung in the air. The clerk backed away from the counter, his hands raised. "He's a wanted man!" Thomas shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at James. "Sheriff, arrest him!" "The sheriff is busy," James said calmly. "Seems he had some unpaid debts at the saloon. We had a long talk about them." Thomas was cornered, a trapped animal. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. His hand moved toward the pistol tucked in his belt. "I wouldn't," James warned, his voice soft as silk. But Thomas was a desperate man. He pulled the gun. He never got the chance to aim it. Margaret had already drawn the revolver James had given her. She didn't think. She just acted. The gunshot was deafening in the small room. Thomas cried out, clutching his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the floor. His two hired men froze, looking from their bleeding boss to the woman with smoke curling from the barrel of her gun. They wanted no part of this. They backed out of the office and fled down the street. It was over. Thomas sank to his knees, whimpering, blood seeping through his fingers. He looked up at Margaret, his eyes filled with disbelief and pain. "I have Robert's letters," James said to the terrified clerk, "and I have a witness." He nodded toward Margaret. "I think you'll find that the deed to this land belongs to her, and I think the new sheriff will be very interested in hearing about Robert Turner's accident." The clerk could only nod, his eyes wide as saucers. Margaret stood there, the gun heavy in her hand, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. She looked down at the man who had destroyed her family. He was just a pathetic, bleeding man on a dusty floor. All the power he'd held over her was gone, vanished in a single moment of fire and smoke. She had taken it back. She turned and walked out of the land office, leaving James to handle the rest. She walked back across the street, her steps sure and steady. Lily was waiting in the doorway of the general store, her eyes wide. Margaret knelt down and pulled her daughter into a fierce hug. "Is the bad man gone?" Lily whispered into her shoulder. Margaret looked back across the street where James was now talking to a newly appointed deputy. Thomas was being hauled away, his face a mask of agony and defeat. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "The bad man is gone." She held her daughter tight, the wooden sparrow pressed between them. They were free. For the first time, truly free. The long winter was finally over. The journey back to the cabin was different. The silence wasn't tense anymore. It was peaceful. The world didn't feel threatening. It felt new, full of possibility. They arrived as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. The cabin felt like a real home now, a sanctuary they had fought for. That night, after Lily was asleep, Margaret and James sat by the fire, just as they had so many nights before. But everything had changed. The ghosts had been put to rest. "What happens now?" Margaret asked softly. James looked at her, the firelight dancing in his gray eyes. "Thomas will go to prison for a long time. The land is yours. You and Lily can do whatever you want. You could sell it, start over somewhere new." The thought of leaving, which had once been her only goal, now felt wrong. Leaving this place? Leaving him? "I don't think I want to run anymore," she said. I think we're already home." James was quiet for a long moment. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the tarnished silver locket. He opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of Robert. "He was my brother," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not by blood, but in every other way that mattered. He would have wanted you to be safe, to be happy." He looked from the locket to her. "I think I want that too." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong, wrapping around hers. It wasn't a gesture of passion, not yet. It was a promise of shared mornings and quiet evenings, of building something new from the ashes of the old. Margaret looked at their joined hands, then at the man who had walked out of a storm and led her back into the light. She thought of the sparrows he'd told Lily about, the ones that were tough enough to stay through the winter. They had stayed. They had survived. And now, spring was coming. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and survival from the wild frontier. And let me know in the comments what you think Thomas's fate should be.